Welcome back to my channel for a Leica episode I couldn't be more excited about. And what you see here in front of me on the table, first of all, on the right hand side you see the Leica Q3, on the left hand side you see the Leica SL3, and in the middle you see another Leica Q3. And my friends, my dear friends, there is only one headline describing what's going on here, namely Leica finally did it. On the Leica Q3 you have a 28mm focal length, and this camera here has been with me on travel many times. And I've also posted a lot of videos about that camera. If you have not seen them, look them up. In particular, I have posted 3 tutorials on how to handle this camera, how to operate it, how to customize it with a lot of tips and tricks. But here now we have finally a different focal length, and the first indication is here on the hot shoe. It says Leica Q3 43, and the 43 stands of course for 43mm focal length. And you also see it here on the lens. If we look at that, this is the Q3 we know on the right hand side. On the left hand side we have 43mm, on the right hand side we have 28mm. And that's a true game changer. And I will explain in the course of the video why I'm really excited about this new Leica Q3. So let's kick this off. Let me quickly do some housekeeping. First of all, I want to thank my friends from Leica Switzerland and Leica Zurich, who again provided me with that pre-production sample of the new Leica Q3 way off before market launch and the release date. And I really appreciate that, because it helps me to get my reviews done, and then when Leica announces the new gear, I'm already there to post my video. This is highly appreciated, it's a great help. Thank you very much, guys. It's always a pleasure working together with you. The second remark concerns my channel, and guys, please allow me to say that only 13% of my viewers are subscribers, and you would really do me a big favor if you would hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, because that helps my channel to grow. And if you like my content, then I think if you would become a subscriber, there is no harm, there is no cost coming with it, but for me it means the world. So thank you very much for your support. Let's talk about design and dimensions, and the first eye-catching difference between the two cameras is the color. So here on the Q328 we have between a matte black finished top plate and bottom plate a black leather texture. That feels beautiful in hands, and Leica changed that color on the Q343 to a very elegant gray. And I don't know if the light here in the studio is picking up on that, but it's beautiful. And to be honest, when I saw it first in the marketing material before I had then the pre-production sample here in my hands, I was not quite sure if I like it. But then when I took it out for shooting, saw it in daylight, I found it's very elegant. There is some beauty, aesthetic coming with it. And the way this is embedded into a black matte finish here on these two plates, top and bottom, looks really good in my opinion. In terms of dimensions, if we compare the cameras, the height is exactly the same. Let's switch this around. Exactly the same height here if you look at that. If we look at them here, exactly the same. There is no difference in dimensions here, and there is something interesting going on if we let them face up here with the lens peeking up out of the camera body. It's exactly the same height. So if you look at that, let me put them even closer. This is the same length you have here in the way the lens is coming out of the camera body. And since a 43mm lens is longer than a 28mm lens in a like-for-like comparison, you see this here, the one in the Q343 is longer than the lens in the Q328. They actually achieved the same length with the lens coming out of a camera body by making the lens hood on the Q328 shorter. If you compare the lens hood, this one is shorter, and that's the trick they used to get kind of the same dimensions here, and that is beautiful. I think that is very nicely done by Leica, and in this way you have the same compactness factor if you carry this camera around with you, although you have here a classical wide angle length and here a classical normal focal length. That the dimensions of the camera bodies are the same is also confirmed by a little experiment I made when I was shooting the camera, and most people who follow me on my channel know I hardly shoot the camera in this type of constellation without a hand grip. So I took the hand grip, which is the inductive charging hand grip for the Leica Q328, and put it on the Leica Q343, and that worked like a charm. Let me show you. Let me screw this in here quickly to show it to you. And if you look at that, it's a perfect fit. It's sitting firmly and without any gaps on the Q3 43 in the same way as it sits on the Q3 28 with this Arca Swiss compatibility here. And I saw a list of accessories already. I guess that the hand grip for the Q3 43 will not have a black leather texture here, but a gray leather texture, but I'm not really sure. In any case, you can use the black one in order to get a firm grip of the camera in your hands. And even with a black hand grip, it looks very aesthetic. I think this is a nice fit, and you can recycle everything you have for the Leica Q3 28, also in the context of the Leica Q3 43. So if the main change on these two Q3 cameras is the focal length 28mm versus 43mm, then what's the point? Well, let me quickly elaborate. First of all, a 28mm lens is a classical wide-angle lens, and I personally love the field of view coming out of that camera. There is a debate in the community whether the 28mm on the Q3 truly is 28mm, maybe it's a little bit less or a little bit more. I don't care, because the footage coming out of that camera is what I want when I take this camera with me on travel and walk through the streets of a foreign city. Now, what's the point about 43mm? Of course, if you evolve from 28mm to 43mm, your field of view will be more narrow. And why is this pleasant? Why is this something people might want to have? Very simple. It's a so-called normal focal length. And now some of you will argue and say, well, a normal focal length is 50mm. I personally think and believe that a lot of people will agree to that a normal focal length has a little bit of a spectrum between 40 and 50mm, and 43mm is exactly that. And in the marketing material, Leica also refers to it and says this is a focal length which comes very close to the field of view human beings have with their natural eyes. And that is something which a lot of people consider to be pleasant. While I have the Witcher and Jennifer here in front of me on the table, because I did not take the camera out yet for portrait shooting, but this is also a focal length which is ideally suited for people photography. It's close to 50mm, it's not as wide as 28mm. You will get a more shallow depth of field. We come to aperture of this lens compared to this lens on the former Q3 in a moment. And it will be a camera which you can take out and have it with you on travel for landscape, as well as for street photography, for reportage photography, as well as for people photography. Of course, you can take photos of people with a Leica Q3 with 28mm, but this is a focal length which makes this topic a bit more exciting, and we are going to look into that. Of course, I've also taken sample images already with that new camera. I will show them later in the video, but as I said, no time for people photography. It's really about cityscapes, and when I was walking around with the camera and trying out a lot of things. If we compare the two lenses here, there is more about it, and let me quickly show you what I mean by that. If I open this up here and remove the lens hood for a moment, so you have a better view inside, you see this is a 28mm Summilux lens, widest open f1.7, 28mm we already discussed. Let's have a look into this one here. If I open this up here and remove the lens hood, then this is no longer a Summilux lens, but you know, whistles, drums, bells. It's an Apo-Summicron. Widest open f2.0, which in terms of widest aperture on an Apo-Summicron is the standard. For instance, if you look into the Leica SL lens portfolio, the 28mm, the 35mm, the 50mm, the 75mm, and so on, they all have a widest open aperture of f2.0. So that's the standard. Why is this the case? Why is it not wider open? It's because typically Apo-Summicron stands for sharpness, contrast, and micro contrast and detail. And if you open the aperture too wide, it becomes a bit more soft. And that's why Leica from scratch in manufacturing these lenses starts with widest open f2.0, and that works quite well. Let's talk a bit more in detail about the two lenses on the Leica Q3 43 and the Leica Q3 28. First of all, when Leica calls this an Apo-Summicron lens, what does Apo mean? And Apo stands for apochromatic lens, and that means that we have minimized color aberrations for an even sharper image with higher contrast, with a more accurate color reproduction from edge to edge. That's what it says. And those of you who are Leica shooters, you guys know that the Apo-Summicron in the Leica M lens lineup, but also in the Leica SL lens lineup, they are always the best lenses you can have for these Leica camera bodies. And that's now built into the Q3 43. The optical design of this new Apo-Summicron here built into the Leica Q3 43, we have a precise optical design featuring 4 aspherical elements, and that ensures, of course, the incredible sharpness we are used to on Apo-Summicron lenses, and it helps the color accuracy, as I mentioned before, what Apo stands for, namely apochromatic. And the full frame sensor in this Leica Q3, which is, by the way, the exactly same sensor as what we have on the Leica Q3 28, in this way is enabled to reproduce a superior image quality when it comes to the scene in front of the camera and the photo you want to take. On the Summilux in the Leica Q3 28, you also have a built-in macro mode for macro shooting, and you just rotate that macro ring here, and then the scale here changes. Let's have a look again. Here you see how the scale changes, and then this is fit for purpose for close-up shots. And the same is built into this Apo-Summicron lens here on the Q3. Here's the macro ring. We rotate it, the scale changes, have a look here, and then we are good to go for close-up shots. And I've done already a few close-up shots with that camera. I will show them later in the sample images. Last but not least, the 43mm focal length here on this new Apo-Summicron built into the Leica Q3 43 has more beauty coming with it. And let me quickly explain, because 43mm is exactly the diagonal of a full frame sensor, and the dimensions of a full frame sensor are 36 times 24mm, and the diagonal is exactly that, namely 43mm. And that means that the proportions and distances are accurately reproduced without any distortions. And as I mentioned before, this is a normal focal length, which is kind of getting you the same perception as you would look at the scene with your naked eyes. Just a very beautiful concept. And by the way, if for you a 50mm is the one and only focal length which represents a normal focal length, then there is no harm using the Q3 43, because by just cropping in a little bit, you get an easy simulation of a 50mm field of view, but for your shooting experience, you have that extended field of view coming from a 43mm lens. So that's something you bear in mind. You can, of course, based on the high resolution of 60 megapixel on that sensor, you can, of course, crop in a little bit and in this way achieve the same field of view as if this one would here be a 50mm focal length, but by the 43mm, you get, like in the rangefinder camera, a little bit more sight on the boundaries of your frame. And that is something which you can, of course, do. I personally think that the 43mm is very pleasant. As I said, I've shot this lens. I will show sample images later on. I think the symmetry you have, the analogy by the diagonal of a full frame sensor is just beautiful. It makes perfectly sense to me to have in here a 43mm and not a 50mm lens. Comparing the heart of every digital camera, there is no difference between the two. The full frame CMOS sensor, which is built in here and built in the Q3 28, is exactly the same. And by the way, it has also on the Q3 43 the triple resolution technology, which enables you to shoot raw images with 60 megapixel, 36 megapixel and 18 megapixel. And some time back I actually showed in a video, which was a bit technical, I should admit that the medium resolution of 36 megapixel is kind of ideal if you want to have the highest dynamic range coming from the Leica Q3 sensor, which is the same Leica Q3 sensor in the Q3 28 and the Q3 43. On the Q3 28, we had digital frames, or let's call it focal length simulations, embedded and implemented in the firmware. And that was something pretty cool, which I showed in my first video when I introduced this camera to the community on my channel. And I've set this function up for this function button here, so let me quickly show you what I mean. First of all, if I don't push that button here, we have a 28mm field of view. If I push the button once, within the frame here, which is indicated now by white lines, I have a 35mm focal length simulation. Pushing it again, it turns to 50mm, pushing it again, it goes to 75mm, and pushing it again, it turns to 90mm. And if I take that shot here, let's have a look. If I go now into the play view here, you see this is really looking like a 90mm lens I've used on that camera. And that's pretty cool, because there's something magical going on. When I had my introductory video on that camera, I showed you that this is actually not looking like a digital crop. It looks really, really natural. And the same is implemented now, of course, in the new Leica Q3 43, but since we have as a starting point here 43mm and not 28mm, by the way, let me show you the difference here on the native view. This is 43mm and this is 28mm. You see how much far Jennifer is away here in this wider angle, the wider field of view coming from 28mm. Here is much closer, of course, but the simulation, I put it up on the same function button here, has now different focal length simulation. So this is 43mm. If I push the button once, it jumps to 60mm within that frame. If I press it again, it's a 75mm simulation, then it's a 90mm simulation, then a 120mm simulation, and last but not least, a 150mm simulation. Let me take that shot to show you how this looks like, because it's pretty cool. Now if we go into play, you see this is a perfect portrait. And you don't see in the way how natural this image appears that this is computational photography that's going on here. Really cool what Leica implemented here. I love the way this is implemented on both cameras, and I actually use in my shooting when I travel with the Leica Q3 that framing feature, that focal length simulation feature very often. What I definitely want to do now is looking into the menus of these two cameras and see if we spot any differences, if there is anything new on the Q3 43 which was not there on the Q3 28. But before doing that, let's quickly complete the specifications of these two cameras. And I mentioned already the sensor is exactly the same, backside illuminated, so acronym BSI CMOS sensor, triple resolution technology, and so on. We spoke in detail about the two lenses, Apo-Summicron versus Summilux, 43mm versus 28mm. I think the last data point I want to contribute here is the weight. And the Q3 28 has a weight of 740 grams with battery, and the Q3 43 has a weight of 794, so a little bit heavier, but as I showed before, the dimensions are kind of exactly the same. The menu structure and the menu entries on the Q3 28 and the Q3 43 are exactly the same. At least I didn't spot any differences. And what's also eye-catching here is that the new icons, the new symbols, which Leica introduced on the influencer event back then for the Leica SL3 on the Leica campus in Wetzlar, they have not yet found their way into the Q3. And that was one of the questions we asked in the Q&A session, if the Leica icons, or acronymed Leicans, will find their way into the Q3. So far, Leica missed the opportunity with the introduction of a new Q3 to introduce them to the Leica Q world. Pity, but it is what it is. Now here you see the status or control screen, however you want to call this, is exactly the same. I've already accidentally reset my Q3 43, and that's why no favorites menu is set up there. But if we flip over to page number 1, you see this starts with main menu and ends with ISO. So it's exactly the same menu structure, no change at all. Turning pages to page number 2, no difference at all. It starts with auto ISO settings and it ends with scene mode. Page number 3, also no change. Optical image stabilization leads the page at the beginning and then it ends with exposure preview. And I also went into the various submenus. I didn't spot any differences. The same continues on page number 4 and on page number 5, as well as on page number 6. So here Leica really leveraged and recycled what they built into the Q3 28 and used it for the Q3 43, which in my opinion makes perfectly sense. So you saw the little slideshow. The image quality coming from the new Q3 43 is kind of what I'm used to from the Q3 28. There is not a big difference. Image quality is just very good. So here's an image from a sunny day in Bern, the capital city of Switzerland. And if you look into that, everything is super sharp, very crisp, looks really good. Colors are nice. It was a blue sky, sunny day. Looks really good. I have absolutely nothing to complain about the image quality of this camera. Here another image, this time in landscape format. Let's go into that. Very good. And if you look at that, that's actually a very nice field of view. So with a 43mm lens, you can definitely go and shoot landscape and cityscapes, even if it is not as wide as 28mm. And again here, really good image. I like a lot what I'm seeing here. Let's see what else I want to show here. Several images. So here is one which is interesting, because if I reset this, you see this has falling lines, and that is a trick, a technique you can use, of course, if your field of view is more narrow than what you're used to from wide angle lenses. Just point your camera a little bit up and you will get falling lines, of course. And then later on in Lightroom, correct the perspective to a nice image where you get straight lines. Simple like that. Let's continue. Let me go back into the library. What else did I want to show here? Oh yes, macro, of course. I showed before how you turn the macro ring to switch into the macro mode, and that looks really good. It's very sharp, very nice. Look at that B here. Really well done. And of course you then get also a very shallow depth of field. And look at here how many details this lens is capturing, and that sensor in the Leica Q3, 43mm. Very good. Let's see what else do we have here. I think that's it on the macro side. Here's another little image on the macro side. If you look at that, I cropped in already. Very sharp, very shallow depth of field in the background, and by the way, a very good transition between sharp and not so sharp areas of the image. I think that looks good. Micro contrast is something many people pay attention to. Look into that image here. And if you look at the different tonalities here, this is captured very well. This is, by the way, the so-called Bundeshaus. This is where the Swiss Parliament is meeting in our capital city in Bern. And it looks really good. Here, different type of buildings. Here is a very famous hotel. It's the Bellevue Palace. I lost it. I'm sorry. Here we go. Very nice, nicely captured, and so on and so on. Here, by the way, I shot the panorama image. That's another way of getting a wider angle. And here I was using the camera in portrait mode and then shooting 7 frames and stitching them together in Lightroom. And that turned out to be then an image of 171 megapixel. And if I crop in here, you get so many details. Look at that. This looks really good. Let's walk around here a little bit. Let's see what we find. Very nice. Lots of details. Here 2 people walking on the street, someone on a bike. Very cool. And if you crop in here, you see 2 people walking here on the streets. You see graffiti on the house walls. Very nice. A lot of details. And in this way, by turning the camera by 90 degrees, going into portrait mode, and then stitching together several frames into a very large and high resolution panorama picture is another option. How you can work around the fact that a 43mm lens natively has a more narrow field of view. I think that's basically all I wanted to say and show here. Let me see if there's anything else. Oh yes, by the way, there is something else I wanted to show, namely this one here. This is a fuzzy image. It's not sharp. You see this here, and this comes from an exposure time which is too long for handheld shooting. And I was not mounting intentionally my camera on a tripod here. I was getting up early morning and taking the shot to the casino in Bern, again, the capital city of Switzerland. And I was trying to find out, based on optical image stabilization, now with a longer focal length of 43mm instead of 28mm, how long can I manage to get a shot by handhold shooting instead of mounting it on a tripod. And half a second, widest open at f2.0 and ISO of 100 was just too long for me. I have not the most calm hands in the world, so I actually made the exposure time shorter, means the shutter speed faster, and increased this to 1/4 seconds at f2.0. And this looks already better if you compare this. This has more fuzziness and is more blurry based on half a second. 1/4 seconds already looks better, but is not sharp enough. You still see that this camera for this exposure time with my hands and capabilities should be mounted on a tripod. And then I increased by 1 more stop to 1/8 seconds the shutter speed, so made it by 1 full stop faster, and now it worked. This is now a really sharp image. And if you think about that, 1/8 seconds is really an effective optical image stabilization, and OIS is never as effective as an IBIS. IBIS is in-body image stabilization, where the sensor is actually stabilized, and OIS is never as powerful as IBIS, but here with 1/8 seconds it actually worked. And let's quickly do the math. So according to the normal rule of thumb, if we have a 43mm focal length, we should have about 1/80 seconds. And one full stop of gains would be 1/40, another one would be 1/20, another one would be 1/10. So I have basically here a gain of 3 full stops by optical image stabilization. And that's a really good result for a not so wide angle lens, namely a 43mm lens, which is a normal focal length. And that really helps. So this image looks good and was shot without a tripod. Look at that. This is really sharp and crisp. There is motion blurriness here from that person and that person walking in the scene, but the tram here, the train is super sharp, the buildings are super sharp. That really worked. So 3 full stops of gain based on optical image stabilization. In terms of image quality, there is one more thing I wanted to show, namely these focal length simulations. And here we are at the first focal length of the ones I described. Then I apply the first focal length simulation, get closer, another one even closer, another one even closer, here another one, and here the last one. And if you look at that, this looks really like a native portrait. Really good. Of course, the resolution has been reduced and so on, but if you want it with AI software, you can scale this up to a higher resolution, and the result of these focal length simulations embedded into the firmware of the Leica Q3 28 and also now on the 43 is really, really good, and I like a lot this feature. What else should be mentioned? Well, in the same way as in the Leica Q3 28, this camera here features a lot of sophisticated video capabilities. We can shoot up to 8K. Let me quickly swipe here in the menu. So I go here and swipe into video, and then I go into the menu, and then you see here later on the video format and resolution, for instance on MOV, that we can go up to 8K, cinematic 8K, and so on. So all the video capabilities we have on the Q3 28mm, they are also here on the Q3 43mm, and that can be very pleasant because with the widest open f2 on a 43mm lens, I think you can become quite cinematic in your video filming. So that's quite nice to have. In addition, I should mention that I saw a list of accessories which will be brought to market for the Q3 and the Q3 43. I think you guys have heard and seen when this one here was introduced on the wireless charger. The hand grip I mentioned already. The battery is the one with the larger capacity, which I mentioned in various videos on the SL3 and the Q3 when the Q3 was introduced. And so on and so on. There is a lot coming, and what will also be provided to the Leica Photos app, of course we have the full connectivity here. Let me quickly go there to show you. So if we go here into the menu, and then we go here into Leica Photos, you see this is the same functionality as what we have on the Q3 28 and the Leica SL3. And with the introduction of that camera, Leica in the marketing material promised to bring a new Leica look, which is called Leica Chrome. So I use the Leica looks from time to time. I think Leica engineers spend a lot of effort to calibrate these color schemes, and I personally like to play with them. That's basically all I wanted to say and show. Here are the 2 Q3 cameras, one with 43mm, one with 28. In the future you can travel with 2 compact cameras and have 2 very, very common focal lengths at your disposal, while here probably the more common one is 50mm, but based on what I explained before, 43mm is the sensor diagonal of the full frame sensor built into this camera here, and therefore it should actually provide a beautiful normal focal length look. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.